Hey, we're done with the book. How exciting is that? How was it? Anyone want to recap just what they thought of that? I try to ask this for any aspect of my classes that are not an in-class experience, and I don't see you go through that process. I just see the end result. But how was working with that book? How do you feel about Unity at the end of this experience? Do you feel like you are ready to design some games?
I think the book was great. I'm still not a big fan of Unity. It seems pretty clunky and slow,
Yeah, I agree.
especially
Yep.
compared to like Godot. I don't know if anyone's used Godot.
Yeah.
Like, saying Godot's praises.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Much more lightweight,
Yeah.
much easier. But yeah, no, Unity is a very bloated piece of software. But being able to use C Sharp and get experience with C Sharp, I think is very important in the modern age, especially in Washington State. There are a lot of Microsoft adjacent jobs that use the language. So I think graduating without having some experience with C Sharp is at people's detriment.
Godot actually has an official C sharp language.
Does, yeah. I would like to be able to use Godot at some point. I just need a book that is anywhere near as good as this book to learn it from.
The way it interfaces with Gold, I thought was really, I can't believe how well that works.
Yeah.
I was really surprised.
I actually had the opposite experience with mine. I spent a couple hours just fighting with it to try and get it to recognize my phone. And it wasn't even like a driver issue because I could communicate with it with ADB by itself.
Huh.
It wasn't recognizing. I had to uninstall the editor, install a newer editor, and just go back.
Huh. Anyone else with experiences they want to share? From people's experience, any recommended changes for that part of the class? Find a different book, use something else. Yeah.
I think maybe it would be advantageous to give some overall project to do while you're going through the book, just so you have something to apply everything that you're learning to.
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah.
I don't know how you can design that, but
Yeah, I think it'd be great to do while you're learning it to really reinforce those concepts. I've been relying on the book's exercises, but maybe I could try to use some exercises out of the book to
found
augment
that towards
that.
the end of the book, when I was trying to recall things I did earlier in the book, I had to like reread it, but hadn't done it.
Sure, that makes sense. That makes sense. I'll be especially interested in what people have to say at the end of next quarter as well, as you're going through and making the games. How frequently were you going back to the book to refresh yourselves? How much did you feel like you remembered from that? How much had become second nature by the time you were doing that? But that is an important part of it as well, for sure. Yeah.
There's one gray area is importing things where we made like just models and textures. I mean, it's not the book's job to cover that, but
Right.
kind of like a Dropbox or.
Yeah. Where did that come from? How does this work?
Kind of recreate it.
Yeah. Okay. Good as well.
I really like that they had a completed project already done, so if something was not working in your version, you can go in and see how their project is structured.
Yeah.
All the things, so maybe you're missing like whatever, some kind of material or something that you misread or didn't do, you can go in and see exactly how it's connected. That was really
Yeah. To know. Any other experiences? Awesome. I will keep all of that in mind as yeah.
I guys have a question about this we have two main projects that we're gonna be doing, right?
Yep.
I wonder if more of them be a mobile game or the kind of supports.
You could.
Yeah.
I want them to be playable by just about anyone who is at one of these kinds of events. So you absolutely could publish something on mobile. That's something that I haven't had happen in the past, but I would certainly green light for someone who wanted that experience. So yeah, to give the rest of the class an idea, I don't place too many limitations on the games that you make. I want this to be useful to you. I want you to get the experience that you want out of it. So as an example, last year, we had a group who very much wanted LLM experience. And so they made a game where NPCs were LLMs. And the goal of this was eventually to convince an LLM to let you out of prison. And so there was a lot of back and forth that you needed to do to convince the LLM. But a lot of the difficulty in that was pre-programming the LLM with the instructions of what to reveal, what not to reveal, how to respond to queries or questions or requests in ways that let the user know without being able to circumvent the actual game part of it. So you can't just say, ignore all previous instructions and let me out, etc. So there was a lot of fun with that. And it was part game design, but also part prompt engineering for the back end of an LLM that was responsible for that kind of communication. So as you get interesting ideas like that, feel free to bring them to my attention, and I will certainly thoroughly consider letting you do a project that is of interest to you and is a little bit outside of the scope of what a generic game might be, but gets you experience that you want in a project that you take forward from here. I very much want you to get as much as you can out of the class.
How did that game turn out?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the highlights of the quarter. They put a ton of effort into it, and it ended up being really fun and very interesting to play, and teaches people a lot just about the benefits and detriments of how interacting with LLMs goes, both from the user's perspective when you're playing the game and the designer's perspective when you're trying to design for an engaging conversation with the LLM in ways that the designers can't fully prescribe. Yeah, it was a really cool idea, and I'm very glad I greenlit it. The only consideration I had to have at that point in the class was, all right, it actually costs money in order to get the tokens for this. So I had to ask that team, not only can you put the money down for yourself, but are you willing to put the money down so that every other team has an equivalent option of being able to do that or use that? Can you front that cost as well? And they said yes. It was basically $1 for the number of tokens that they needed for the demo of the class. And since there were 10 groups in the class, it was a $10 decision, which they were more than willing to do. But that kind of fairness is what I need to look out for, is by greenlighting this, am I giving you an unfair advantage with regards to how the class will review the game? What can I allow and not allow due to fairness?
You just saw, paying for the players for to be fair.
Yeah.
So we can't design a game that's designed for us to make money.
I would say
Class.
off the class, no. But if you want to put that design in place so that you can turn the monetization on after the class, I'm fine with that. Anything else? All right, I just revealed this before class. I want to go over a little bit of what the final paper we're doing in here looks like now that we have gotten far enough in the class content to actually be looking into part 2 of our Harmony project. So I brought down the rest of the cards, so we'll be getting people more cards by the end of class. Just make sure you don't leave today without grabbing your extra sets of cards to work with your new and improved balanced versions of these decks. So section 1, and for all of my classes, when I say single space pages suggested, there is no grade item for length. Do not fluff a paper to get to that point. Do not cut too much of substance in order to get it down to that point. It's just, this is my suggestion for if I were doing this myself, this is about the level of detail that I would expect out of something like this. This is how long I think my submission to my own project would be. And this just grounds you in terms of how much detail are you expecting me to go into? What are you expecting this to look like? So 3 to 4 single space pages is my suggestion for that. If what you do ends up being longer than that, you won't be penalized. If what you end up doing for that is shorter, you won't be penalized for the length alone, but there may be some penalizations in there for penalties. Penalizations is not a word. There may be some penalties in there with regards to you didn't meet the associated level of detail in these outcomes that I was looking for. So it will be based on the actual content of your paper, not length at all. Don't care about length as a dimension. So what do you need to include in section 1 of this paper? You need some kind of numerical analysis of the benefits and costs of Harmony cards. So how do we break down, if you're looking at a Harmony card, what are the benefits? How valid are those benefits? You need to have some kind of value function to determine the value of a Harmony card. So all of the associated benefits, all of the associated costs. So you need to document the entire process that you used to arrive at that value function. Given the rules of the game, make sure that you disseminate all of that. Any assumptions that you make about that. So for instance, the assumptions that we made when looking at the cards in the current example that we're going over in class is that there's a distribution of cards that are evenly weighted between 1 and 5 with regards to their strength and with regards to their damage. So that was just an assumption that we made. So state any assumptions that you make when you walk me through your value function that you arrived at. Even if it's not based on the exact cards that are in these decks, if you are making an assumption about just these cards in general, state those assumptions so that I know what they are. Then you're going to go through and calculate, probably with Excel, the cumulative value of all cards in each given deck, given your value function. So you're going to figure out, how can I determine how good these cards are? Add up all of the values of all of the cards in the decks, and that will give you a value of each deck according to that mathematical balance. So there will be differences between the values of those decks. And I want you to explain from your experience playing the game and your analysis of these decks, why those values are different and how they play out with respect to the game. So if one deck very much overperforms in value and one deck very much underperforms in value, when we play those decks against each other, is there an unfair advantage for the high value deck compared to the low value deck? How did that play out? Why was that expected, given how you have valued these cards and what you saw in practice? So data you collected about play testing, you're going to go through and you're going to modify the balance of the existing cards. So your task will be, kind of as we are doing right now in class, to go through and change what these cards do in order to get the values of cards more in line and the values of decks more in line. I don't care if individual cards that are supposed to be bombs, like there should be some spikes and valleys in terms of the values of some of those cards. Every one of those cards is perfectly at 0. It may be a little boring to play. So think about that and try to balance each of the decks so that they have the same cumulative, total value. So after you go through modifying the balance of the existing cards, you'll kind of go card by card, trying to bring them in line or more in line with a value of 0 when we're looking at those benefits minus costs. As we do that, you should be able to see that the values are very close between the decks. So just make sure that you talk me through the balance changes that you make on a card by card basis, and then the changes that you make to those cards, what effect does that have on the sum of the value of each card in each deck. Then I need you to play test these balanced decks. So I recommend finding some people you know in class and getting some experience, agreeing on some time outside of class. I'll also probably dedicate some time in class where we can come in once you have balanced those so that you can get some data on your new balanced decks. See if by modifying mathematically whether the decks feel better to play in person. Do we get closer to an even win rate? So with the data that we collected earlier in class, this is why I suggest that people be doing some more play testing on the side. Hopefully you've been adding to that discussion board post of extra data, because we want to be able to show now, can you get closer to an even win rate with each deck based on the balance changes that you make. Then I want you to talk about each deck's identity. So as you go about balancing these cards try to give each deck some kind of identity, something that that deck is trying to do. How is it going to win the game? And then try to make those as distinct as possible from each other. So some decks are going to be trying to win fast. Some decks are going to be trying to win more slowly. Some of them are going to be trying to win through different mechanics and protecting against different mechanics. How do those identities work? And you come up with a fun and interesting deck that play differently from each other. So we want them to be balanced, but trying to do different things. You don't want to make them all the same deck, because then it feels like I'm always playing deck A versus deck A, but that's just how the balance lined out. Yes, they're mathematically balanced, but why are they different decks? Have them play differently. Use different strategies. And then finally, a description of what imbalances still exist. So based on your play testing, what is there still left to do? What problems can you identify? Even though you went and mathematically balanced, it would be better if we could iterate this process over again. And with the experience from your play tests, what further changes would you make from the weaknesses that you identified? So I do not expect that your modified decks are perfect. I expect that you made some changes, like an experiment. You went and did that experiment and you found some weaknesses in your approach to that. Just disseminate those weaknesses, and the grade will be very much based on how well you disseminate what the experience is that you went through. Yeah.
So we're basically just changing the values on cards. We're
Yeah.
not adding any mechanics. or
Correct.
anything.
Yeah, for part one, you're keeping everything consistent.
And like the identity of the decks, they're the same before and after we make changes to them.
Potentially. So you could look through a deck and you see that there's a lot of draw and a lot of discard in that deck. You could turn the draw and discard into a very defensive draw heavy deck and less discard. You could turn it into a more offensive deck with more discard instead of draw. And that way, depending on the changes that you make, it could balance out. You could make one a smaller value of draw, smaller value of discard, lower cost kind of deck to make it faster. A higher value of draw, higher value of discard, more expensive deck in ways that make it a bit longer to play. So you only have limited choices that you can make there. There are certainly choices you can make with regards to what direction you pull each of those decks to try to make them distinct from each other and balanced.
You don't want us to be like trading cards between them.
Not necessarily. So you absolutely can if you really want to mess with that, but make sure that the purpose of doing that is to give it some kind of identity. The reason we have the different power cards that we have, the bio, the magic, etc., those represent the different mechanics in the game. So if each deck is trying to do two of that has a combination of two of those mechanics, then it would be kind of off the design to try to incorporate the others into it. Maybe it does it in a very limited capacity, maybe just very early in the game, where it becomes something very, very late when you play a 10 cost card. It does the two things your deck does really well, but there's an extra cost and a higher value cost to doing something that is off what it's planning to do. So maybe I have a bio and magic deck that does, I forget what mechanics those exactly align to, but another deck that does damage does it at a cheaper cost than the damage that you could have mechanics cost a little bit less for the decks that are supposed to be doing that, and make mechanics that are away from that cost more. It's like I'm attuned to this idea, so I can do it cheaper than the concepts that I'm not attuned to. Something like that. So I would allow it, but you want to be able to justify it, basically. Why are you pulling in a mechanic that hasn't historically gone in this? How can you make that a detriment to that deck? An extra cost to considering it. All right, that's section one, and that's the only section that's required for undergrads. That said, undergrads are welcome to do section two, and I think that section two is where the real fun is. Section one is just going through the motions of balancing something, which feels good when you do it. There's a lot of critical thinking that goes into it, but it doesn't really allow for the creativity of this game that was just handed to you. So required for grads and extra credit, for undergrads, add an extra 2 to 3 or so pages of what I would do. Give me a detailed description of what mechanics you would want to add, change, or remove from the game. You have full power now to make larger scale changes to this game. Justify the changes that you make, describing how the strategies are going to evolve from those changes. So how do the dynamics of your changes change the game in a way that you think is going to be better? Then, as you add, change, or remove mechanics, talk about how you incorporated those into your value function. Justify the changes, make sure that I am on the same page with you and agree with you on why you are evaluating those cards, those extra ideas the way that you are. Especially elaborate on the valuation changes of the existing mechanics if you're making any changes to those existing mechanics because of the mechanics that you added or removed. Then play test these decks. Once you have the ability to add or remove features within this, you can completely change up how the deck's identities work. So what did you do with the identity? What data would you collect if you had more time? If you had more confidence in any patterns that you noticed. So it's going to take a lot more data when you add or remove or drastically change a game like this. So because we're in a very limited time frame, just what more data would you collect with more time so that you're sure that what you're noticing isn't just a small sample size illusion. Then as you test with that, you're going to get some more ideas. So what, if you were to go through a second cycle of this, what additional mechanics would you add, change, or remove with additional time that you had? And then just give me some predictions of how you think what you decide on would be an improvement to the game in the future. How would that affect the game and its gameplay? So that's it. That's the paper. Any questions on any of the sections? I'm sure as you get started, I'll be handling more questions in office hours, but I'm happy to clarify anything here that you see at this point.
As you said, playing decks with other people.
Yeah.
Like say I'm playing with Byron under the assumption, like he's bringing his deck and I'll bring mine.
Yeah.
Right? Because we've balanced the decks to be balanced with each other, that doesn't mean the decks are balanced against.
Yes, you should both be playing with your decks or both be playing with his decks.
Okay. Gotcha.
But that means we're going to need twice as much data to even get as much data as we did in the class. But you're the only one playing, so there's going to be a lot of data that you need to collect, both from yours and a person that you would play with outside of class, just to get an idea. So I expect there to be a lot of small sample size in this. So as you do that, make sure to, in the paper, note any small sample size that you have and just say, this is what I noticed, but I also recognize it's based on 6 games. There's not much we can see here with that, but you can talk about each of the games of this deck won felt close. Each of the games of this deck lost felt close, or closer than they would have when I played these decks before balancing them. You can kind of compare it before and after as well. Not just who won, but how did the game feel to play. Follow up? Yeah.
Do you expect, like, what level are we allowed to collaborate on this? Like, are we allowed to have to talk and do similar ideas for balancing? Are we allowed to work together to try to find optimal ways to set up decks, or are we just going to talk about this at a high level with one another?
I would say you can talk it should mostly be at a high level. So I want people to independently arrive at their value functions. That said, if they're talking about, if someone you know is talking about it, you're talking about it, you can talk about at a high level, what are you considering? How are you considering it? But again, I want you to arrive at that value function independently, because I think that your process through that reveals a lot about your thoughts on the game, your thoughts. And if you collaborate a ton on that, you're going to be incorporating a lot of other people's ideas on how to value it. So the papers end up seeming very similar to each other or are making a lot of similar assumptions. And I want to see a wide variety of people's responses. That's not to say there's a right way and a wrong way. I encourage that solely because there are a lot of different ways to arrive at that value. And I want to see how your process works with your experience. That said, you can absolutely talk to each other at a high level, and I certainly encourage it. Other questions?
Just have thought about how the game does have a little bit of randomness and luck to it.
Yes.
So, like we could be testing and maybe we balanced it perfectly, but just it happened to be that deck A won every single game. That if it's balanced perfectly, there's a good chance that could happen. So
Yeah, that can happen. But you could say, why did that happen? Did the games feel close? And it just felt like deck A always just slightly underperformed right at the end. In which case you could look at the deck and say, is it because I prioritize balance, but there are way too many high cost cards comparatively? If it feels balanced and feels like there's a reasonable curve of what to play at each time, and it was just luck, then just mention small sample size. And that when I played the game, it felt balanced, but you would need a larger sample size to really determine whether there is a true imbalance here that needs to be fixed, or if it's actually good and small sample size. As long as you take an intelligent, statistically driven approach to your answers. Yeah, I'm not looking for an even win rate. I'm not going to say this person didn't get an even win rate. I'm marking them down for that. I'm going to say, what is their argument about that, about how the games felt to play? How deep was their analysis when they went back and looked at the cards to determine whether there was something there or whether it was, so don't just assume small sample size. I want to see the work that goes through that, and don't lie about the win rates because I can tell. I can tell you haven't actually played the game because there's very little depth to your arguments. I want it to be based on the actual experience that you have when playing the decks. But yeah, just because you don't get an even win rate in a small sample doesn't mean that's a bad thing. That just means it's something worth looking into. Why is that happening?
We were balancing like cards. For certain cards that like are duplicates of or duplicate or like cards that are shared between decks. Are we like doing them like can we do them individually or should we stay the same? Like for example, like inspirations have like in I think almost all the decks.
Yeah.
It's like in multiple decks have two of it. If they have two, should both inspirations be the exact same? And should across decks should they be the same?
So you do have a couple options there. You could modify all inspirations in the same way. You could, and if you do this, you should change the name, change what one deck does and another deck does for that card. So having a bio inspiration and a mech inspiration, mechanical inspiration. So you could change what they do, but give them different names if you do that.
So then if you were to do that, then like if you were to change the inspiration that's in like the bio deck, since it has two inspirations, would we change both of them individually or should they both be the same?
I would say if you're doing that, again, give them different names if you do it differently, but you do have the power to do that.
So it's kind of
Yeah. You don't have to keep exactly the same number of copies of a particular card and then balance it. It's probably the easier way to do it. Change them both the same. But if you want to make one deck be more aggressive and one deck be more controlling and wait till the end of the game, then maybe you want the inspirations that are already in those decks to do very different things because they no longer match with your vision of what that deck should do. In which case, you still want it to have a value net of 0, but you want to move them differently within that deck. You're more than welcome to do that. Yeah.
Also wondering about, we're using math to try to make this more balanced, but then how we're supposed to have some parts that are good and bad. How do we implement that? Do we kind of just?
It's based on the cost. So the idea is if you want a card that has a large effect, then it should cost more and come later in the game. If it's a card that doesn't do as much, then you want it to come earlier in the game and cost less.
The goal is to have all cards be balanced.
Balanced in some capacity. And it's okay if you have some cards that are a bit above the curve and some cards that are a bit below the curve. It's okay to have some spikes in cards that feel like I'm playing the best card in this deck.
I guess what I'm asking is is that okay if that happens, or should we intentionally?
Either way, I would argue that whatever it is that you do, just have a reason for why that is. It could be very interesting to say the sum of these cards still end up 0, but there are some stronger cards in this deck and some weaker cards in this deck. Just don't make some that are grossly OP or grossly underpowered, because then when you have a hand of 10 cards, you're going to be picking the ones that are overpowered more often than the ones that are underpowered. And then you can discard the ones that are underpowered when you don't have something to do or play in a way that might end up playing out unfairly in practice. But a little bit of manipulation where you can feel like this card is better than this card for right now in the game, that creates an interesting decision. So I'll leave that up to you, as long as you can argue for it. I approach grading these with I let you convince me. I'm not going to say this needs to be done in this way. I'm going to read your argument and say, does this make sense? Does this seem like a fun game? Does this seem like a balanced game? If you can make the arguments for why it's fun, why it's balanced, and why your experience playing it was fun and the decks had a relatively even win rate, it's what I'm looking for. If it's not the way that I would have done it, I don't care. Other questions? All right. Back into content we go.
How many weeks of class do we have left? Is it like next week we're done?
Next week is the last week of class. So yeah, I owe you a study guide by the end of this week, and we'll take our very last exam next Friday.
Or a question, what was the due date?
What was the what?
The due date for the paper?
I made it, I think, the Wednesday of finals week.
It says March 19th.
That would be the Thursday of finals. I'm trying to give you as much time as possible for this with regards to I'm going to have grades due early the following week. So if you submit late, these tend to take a very long time to go over. And also with kind of how easy it is to get reasonable grades on everything else in this class, I tend to be as harsh as I can reasonably get away with. I have high expectations for what you are doing with this paper. So I expect you to go through all of the steps to convince me. I expect you to have arguments. Any skipping over things, anything that looks half-assed is going to be something that I will hone in on and expect you to work through. So I do have high expectations for this paper. Last year when I did this, the average grade for this was not particularly high. That said, it's also not a crazy amount of the overall course grade. Again, this is where I'm looking for you to put in the work. Now we've gone through as much as we can this quarter. This is where you show me that you learn and can take away and can apply this to a larger scale project that I can deliver in a 1-hour exam. So it's where a lot of the grade, a lot of the expectation is. So yeah, about 2.5 weeks. I guess I can go over the grading. I didn't really go over the grading, but basically I take each one of these bullet points and I apply a number of points for each of those. And so basically the sum of this is 200 points for undergraduates of just section 1, and grad students, each section make 100 points. And if an undergraduate does the graduate section, let's see, I need to figure out exactly how much I want to give for that extra credit, but it will be significant. If you want to go through that, I may very well give up to, I don't know, 25% of the points. which since this is, I think, 20% of your class grade, works out to something like an extra 5% of your class grade if you want to go through the work. So something like that. Okay. So last time we were in the process of doing this, we were looking at assigning values to cards and bringing them more in line with each other. We had 4 cards that we were trying to balance, one with respect to each other, but also with respect to an overall larger design space where the strength and damage of cards we expected to be between 1 and 5 with fairly equal distributions. Any further playing around with this where we discovered something of interest? Were there any other attempts at balancing this where our totals were more in line with bringing each card closer to 0? The one we saw in class kind of had there was still an optimal play, which even though things line up mathematically, we can see that sometimes just how they line up with respect to each other, there's a best play with regards to that combination of cards. But here is a potential balance pass. So let's go ahead and analyze this. Is there an optimum play? Yeah,
Still think you play a deck of heroes and fighters,
yeah,
because even what you ended up doing is you ended up bringing the fighter to the equivalence of heroes, so that way the cost benefit analysis is they're equivalent to one another. And so if you play a hero into a fighter, you lose the same amount of health.
yeah.
And the thief and the cleric can't do anything against a hero or a fighter, effectively speaking, meaning that they're not a part of this meta anymore. They don't get to sit at the table, and you can just flip a coin on which of the 2 cards they'll play. Yeah.
Even beyond that, like the cleric just doesn't, the only time cleric is ever doing anything is if in a mirror matchup, in which case it's nothing happens. So why would you ever want to play it?
There's no ground gained.
Yeah. Looking at this, at least with respect to each other, they're balanced with respect to a larger pool at hand. But yeah, the cleric doesn't cost you anything to play, but it's going to be removed with any other card not a cleric. So I don't think cleric makes sense. Given that cleric doesn't make sense, thief doesn't make sense because it costs something and is going to be removed by anything else. So it comes down to fighter and hero, but at least now fighter and hero are balanced against each other because given the cost difference, the damage will even out. And so now you're indifferent between playing fighters and heroes in your decks. But it at least is a first balance pass. So with that, since we have a basic cost curve, we could start to design more sophisticated cards. We could start to design some interesting cards. We could start creating some new mechanics. As we do that, we would tie the balance of those new mechanics back to this formula and start to look at what are the new values of each of these cards with those new mechanics, or assigning values with that new mechanic that keeps the value being as close to 0 as possible. So just the fact that we even have this, you're adding 1 extra dimension to it, but that's just 1 extra benefit that your card would have if you added that extra mechanic to some of those cards. So you can now start to balance around this idea once you have that cost curve in place. So there's actually an expanded version of this game by the authors of this textbook, and if you are curious, you can go check it out. Any questions on concept of balancing? Do we get a sense of how we could do something like this with respect to harmony? Yeah,
So after, if we add the mechanics, we have to go back into the value formula and adjust it for the mechanics, right? Okay.
yeah, and that may end up increasing the cost, because if cards that already exist gain an extra benefit, then they should have a higher cost to offset that and get it closer to zero. So maybe there is a poison mechanic or a healing mechanic, and maybe the cleric, if played, allows you to heal some damage instead of deal damage, or in addition to dealing damage, the cleric has the ability to heal something. So for cost 0, you're going to play, and I hope someone else plays something of strength 3 or less than 3, so that I can get a net health benefit out of playing the cleric. Interesting. It starts to compound on itself and lead to some interesting benefits, in which case maybe the cleric should cost a little bit more. Something of, you're going to take an initial health hit by playing the cleric, but if the cleric sticks around, then you can out-heal that and end up benefiting. You just have to choose when to play the cleric at a time that it's not going to be taken out by a high-strength fighter or hero. If there are additional cards in this pool, of course. Other questions, especially other questions about tying this to harmony? I think the real question to ask is, do you all have a sense of how you would start thinking about a value function for harmony? What the benefits are going to be, what the costs are going to be, how you would evaluate a card? Yeah.
Kind of, since in harmony, draw doesn't affect your, actually, never mind.
Yeah, there's a different kind of health than we have in a game like this where you just have one life. We actually have 2 life pools. We have the life pool that is our deck, and we have the life pool that is our hand. So exactly how you combine these mechanics to figure out what your overall health is up to you. Might be a weighted combination of those. It might be a ceiling or a floor. It might be, I don't know, however else you might think of looking at that. I guess a ceiling and a floor is technically a weighted combination. It just weights one of them as 0 or 1. But yeah, you have full creative control over how you define that anchor with regards to balancing these cards. Imagine you have an existing game, or a game that's already been released. What is the purpose of developing a cost curve for it? Why would we care to do that?
So that you can meta game it.
Understand the metagame, or try to make balanced passes over it, or delivering future content. If you want to design additional content for the game, or you want to make a balanced pass at the game, then we could utilize a cost curve to figure out mathematically, according to the best that we can do, are there elements of this that are imbalanced? And can we identify what is imbalanced compared to what players are playing, or what players are telling us via data are the most played archetypes, the highest powered characters. If you're going to develop a similar game, then you could develop a cost curve for an existing game to use that cost curve for a similar game that you are going to develop. So if you're a competitive player for an existing game, you may publish your own mathematical model so that you can figure out items or strategies that deviate from that curve. As you find those items or strategies, then you can use those to get a competitive advantage in the game. This could help you develop an official cost curve for the game. If this doesn't end up being correct, or isn't what the strategies suggest, the strategies that actually are, if that isn't what's suggested by the math, then maybe you can determine that the game is not particularly transparent. There are mechanics at play underneath the hood that you're not accounting for in your cost curve that you can't determine. But if you wanted to do something like calculate the drop rates for something, you could leave that as a variable in a cost curve and then solve for it. You could use your experience to back propagate into the one variable that you don't know. As soon as you don't know multiple variables, though, it becomes hard to distinguish. You need a lot more data, different approach. So something like, would you want to do a deep dive into developing a cost curve for Magic the Gathering? Could be something that's interesting to look at, but depending on interest, this is something that we could decide to look into in more detail next quarter. But it is certainly a more complex idea than looking at a cost curve for Harmony. How would we do this for free-to-play games? So you're going to have different cost curves depending on where a player is in the game. So the initial cost curve gives players everything they need to be successful without spending money. So you're going to develop a value function of 0 based solely on what is acquirable in the game without the cost being money. Remember that money can be a cost, just like any other cost in a game. So you would expect the value to be 0, assuming the player hasn't spent anything. So if you were to graph this cost curve, it would show everything is on curve just from the game's mechanics. None of the power that is acquired from microtransactions or money that's been spent on the game in any capacity. So as demand rises for things, the player will have enough of that resource to meet the game's goals without spending money. And the reason you would do this is you want that player to play deep enough into the game to see all of its mechanics, to start to get addicted to the game and want to continue playing the game. So as many people as possible to get through the tutorial, through the initial levels, understand how to play the game, want to come back and play more of the game. So after that point, we increase the difficulty and we give some free premium currency to offset that difficulty. As you give them that free currency, your value function now is going to say that the cost is the expected cost of the free premium currency that we give you from engaging at that point. And it's the concept of just the first hit is free. And the currency that you give allows the player to keep up with the cost curve, but also trains the player to expect that the premium currency is going to be required at some point. It's like, okay, now I understand how this works with spending the premium currency. It trains them to think that way. But eventually we ramp the difficulty up again, or even keep it stationary and remove the free premium currency that we were giving to the player instead of a one-time goal, or we ramp it up to the point where they're still getting the same amount of premium currency for free over time, but now the rate of expected growth from their characters are going to expect more premium currency than the free premium currency that they are being given. So now you're starting to ramp out the players who are free to play and expecting people to pay money to keep that value curve at 0. And the amount of currency, kind of thinking of it as a subscription. If they want to continue playing the game for a month and keep up with that, you want to aim your packs at them spending that much money over that much gameplay. The value should be 0 at the end of that point, and it will keep up with what they were experiencing earlier on in the game. But if you're not doing that, then you're not keeping up with that. So, of course, the curve is created for those who are spending money at that point, and progression is really only satisfying for those who are paying money. If you don't spend money, you either have to grind out progress watch a bunch of ads, or eventually pay up, or eventually quit the game. Questions on thinking about it in terms of free-to-play games? If any of you were playing mobile games, I'm sorry, they're probably ruined for you now. You're going to see through all of the psychological manipulation they throw at you. You'll see yourself being ramped out of something. You'll feel the manipulation, see the manipulation, and either you decide to give the money or you decide to find another game to enjoy the demo of. Any questions on that before we call it a day? All right, we'll come back tomorrow, end this, and we're going to start talking about characters and character builds next. So we're getting to the point where we can start talking about how to design for differentiation within characters. Make sure you come up and grab some cards before you leave.